Igor Girkin, who led Russia's takeover of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region back in 2014 and 2015, has, from his prison cell in Russia, stated that Russia cannot win the Russo-Ukrainian war in its current state and with its current strategy. So what does all this mean for, number one, Vladimir Putin, Russia's war against Ukraine, and Igor Girkin himself going forward? Привit from Odessa. My name is Connor Klein if you're new to the channel, and I'm an expert in international relations, and I've been living here in the region for many years, so I speak both Ukrainian and Russian, and I'm here to give you a more nuanced and informed and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And this is a very important video to understand, because Igor Girkin is not really opposition in the sense of being an opponent to Russia's war against Ukraine. He's actually very in favor of it, and that's what makes him interesting as a character and as a political figure in Russia now, because he is not pro-Western opposition. He is simply an opponent of Vladimir Putin because he's a critic of how he has conducted this Russo-Ukrainian war, in particular since 2022 and the extended invasion. So basically, he outlines that Russia needs to reform a few different elements to have a realistic chance of prevailing here in Ukraine and destroying Ukrainian independence. Number one is changing the command and control structure of the Russian military, mobilizing the entire economy, or at least much more of the economy, for the war effort. More general mobilization. We did have a mobilization, a partial one, of 300,000 Russian soldiers who were conscripted in the autumn of 2022. However, they need to expand that rapidly, according to Girkin, and improving the morale of the troops by having clear strategic objectives. So let's go through all of those strategic objectives. Well, Vladimir Putin still keeps calling it a special military operation when it's been a war since 2014, and he has not really laid out clearly what the objectives are for Russia. On the one hand, they say, using these very vague terms like demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, and basically being allowed to annex certain regions that they wrote into their constitution. And that might work well with domestic propaganda in Russia. So, for example, what does denazification mean? It's been understood to mean basically regime change in Kiev, the fact that they label anyone who is Ukrainian and against Russia's takeover as basically being a Nazi, which makes very little sense if you look at who the Nazis were in the 1930s, or what fascism is, especially as Russia itself is basically the Moscow-based empire that is revanchist, that has attacked Ukraine to try and stop it from leaving its sphere of influence. And demilitarization is basically that Ukraine won't be allowed to have a military, so they won't be able to defend themselves in the future. Obviously, they wrote in the Constitution that they had annexed territory that they don't control. They said they organized referenda, even though they don't control, for example, Kherson or Zaporizhia, the cities in those opposites. It's just basically farcical. And again, for propaganda terms, maybe that works well internally in Russia and externally. However, for the soldiers on the front line, what are they actually fighting for? Because if it is to conquer all of Ukraine and directly annex it, that is one strategic objective. Is it to just conquer and control a certain part of it? Maybe you can think of France under Nazi occupation in World War II. They had part of France that was under the control of pro-Berlin proxies under Pétain, the former leader of the French army, if I remember correctly, and they were based in Vichy. So the Vichy government, as it's known. So is it just to annex certain parts that they just whimsically wrote into their constitution? Is it to take more, for example, here in Odessa, Kharkiv, other cities, Kiev itself, and then to install some sort of Pétain-like government in maybe somewhere like Vinica in western Ukraine, or is it to have one in Kiev? It's very unclear what this actually means in reality. Demilitarization, well, basically means, I guess, destroying the Ukrainian military, or are they allowed to keep some of it when in a controlled proxy state? So as you see, the war aims are not clear, and Girkin says that in order to it's kind of the first step to mobilize the right resources to actually win the war, they need to outline this clear strategic objective. And the first thing would be stop calling it a special military operation, because obviously that's not what it is, and that is confusing. Is how can you mobilize the entire population and the economy if it's just a special military operation? That obviously is incongruent. So that is the first thing, clearly defining the strategic objectives. And following on for that, then you would mobilize further Russian men, or maybe even women, to fight in the army, because they now have a increasingly manpower shortage in Russia. They've been very good at luring Russian men to the military with relatively huge sign-on bonuses and salaries, especially if you look at the income disparity in Russia. They're not recruiting men in general from Moscow or from St. Petersburg. Where salaries are a lot higher, they're basically taking people from the poorer, more rural areas where maybe they're making 200, 300 euros, $400, whatever it is, a month. And then if they sign up for the military, they get just a huge amount of money. Maybe it would take them many years to earn. They've been recruiting for prisons. They have been people who are maybe in financial trouble. However, there's a limited number of people who are willing, even for money, to go on what is seen increasingly as a bit of a suicide mission, and the chances of coming back alive are pretty slim. They did have a little bit of an uptick in recruitment around the time when Donald Trump won the election, because we can hypothesize that perhaps many Russian men thought that, okay, Trump will get elected, he will force Ukraine to capitulate, and then they could sign up, get the bonuses, and only fight for a few months. And then obviously their chances of survival is a lot higher than fighting until the end of the special military operation. As you see, it's already been over 3.5 years. So the chances of, if you were fighting on the front line in the Russian army, it's got to be minuscule, the chances of actually surviving that without being an invalid at this point of the war. So basically, that is a huge issue, and Russia really needs to make a decision, probably in the next 6 months, if they're going to mobilize or not. And Girkin says that Putin hasn't prepared the population for why they would need to be mobilized again. So we'll have to see with respect to that. Also, the war economy, that has weakened the Russian economy, because basically on paper they're producing tanks or material for the military, and they just put that on the balance sheet. However, it gets blown up in Ukraine pretty quickly without any additional value being created for Russia. It is a huge black hole. So that is another issue that has to be overcome in terms of what are they going to do in terms of mobilizing the economy. They have done things slowly, basically increasing the budget all the time that goes towards defense or goes towards this war. In reality, it's kind of funny that Trump renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War pretty recently. It was obviously a bit more of an accurate description in Russia's case. So those are two of the elements that would be needed in order for victory for Russia in this war, according to Girkin. And also to restructure the command and control of the Russian military, and that is something that you see with the Russian military itself. Very little accountability. Not so many generals have been replaced throughout the war, and even though it has been a train wreck since the very beginning, Ukraine, on the other hand, has replaced the head of the army, Zaluzhny, whether many people agree with that or not, but there is a lot more accountability. So those are his main criticisms, and he's obviously someone who believes in Russia's victory. He's not a pro-Western opponent of Vladimir Putin. So what does all this mean? It means that basically, if you think back to what happened with the Prigozhin mutiny, which must be over 2 years ago at this point, Girkin represents a figure that is a threat to Vladimir Putin, because he is a personality that is we'll say politically to the right of him, in the sense that he is an ultra-nationalist. So just like Prigozhin, he is someone that potentially could be a threat in terms of he's able to criticize Putin and still have a certain amount of reasonably probably violent and connected people within Russia that might want to see a government that is more committed to a complete victory and willing to take those steps. Prigozhin, of course, was motivated also by the fact that he had been seen as a threat to Putin in terms of his control on power, and then they were going to take his Wagner army off him, and he decided to move on Putin. Didn't work out so well for him. Not only did he not overthrow the government, he ended up dead pretty soon afterwards. So for Vladimir Putin, if he continues with the current trajectory, which is almost certainly at best a stalemate in Ukraine for the foreseeable future, he may come under pressure again from a figure like Girkin. There isn't really anyone else who could be seen in the same light at the moment. Putin obviously learned his lesson from allowing Prigozhin to have a private army and to build up a lot of credibility amongst the Russian public, because he was like this one leader, even if he was a war criminal and a psychopath, just like Girkin is as well, that this kind of individual represents a threat. Girkin, on the other hand, which is the other side of the coin, we will see if he continues to be allowed to live. He hasn't. He's been arrested now, I think it's over 2 years, and detained by the Russian authorities. However, he is still alive and able to send out this criticism. So what does this mean on the ground? Basically, it means that the current Ukrainian strategy, according to Girkin, which is basically to force Russia to use up a huge amount of its resources in terms of the economy and manpower, in light of the fact that Russia is not willing, or at least Vladimir Putin is not willing to deploy the entire economy and not willing to go for another mobilization. He hasn't done it for almost 3 years now, is starting to pay dividends, because someone who cares about Russian victory and is in a position to give good analysis is saying that the current Russian strategy will not work. Said Russian victory is not impossible, but they would need to take the steps that he endorses, Girkin, and without that, the best case scenario is a protracted stalemate, and ultimately that is not guaranteed, and actually Ukraine can fully win this war, according to Girkin, if Putin continues with his current strategy. So very interesting to see that analysis. It also correlates largely with my own observations and what I've argued on this channel, also on the lifestyle channel over the last few years. And we see, even with the issues with continued US support for Ukraine, very little has been additionally given that wasn't already authorized prior to Trump's arrival back in the White House, that Ukraine has lost very little territory in the last 2 years. It's just 1% of their territory. It's now less than back after a few months of the war. At that point, Russia occupied about 25% of Ukrainian territory. Now it's 19%. And in 2 years, they've only gone from 18 to 19%. And this summer's offensive gained very, very little. In fact, they've been rolled back in certain parts around Pokrovsk in the last couple of weeks, in the last month, since that summit between Putin and Trump. So it definitely lines up to what we see in terms of Russia's strategy. Very little being gained, huge number of resources being destroyed and undermined. Russia has needed, as I've said for over a year, to find out solutions by the end of the year to manpower, material, and money, and they don't seem to have a strategy to do that. And Girkin's main argument was they should have deployed everything in the beginning to overwhelm Ukraine and have their victory, but because Putin has been more conservative and gone for this incremental strategy of increasing the number of resources, because he's more worried about staying in power in Moscow than necessarily winning the war first and foremost, that we see that the cracks are starting to show, and 2026 could be a very interesting year in the Russo-Ukrainian war if we look at what might happen in Moscow if there's still no progress, significant progress towards victory in the war, and they start to lose out even more in terms of manpower, money, and material, and they're not willing to make the political choices in order to solve those three issues. So I'll leave it at that. Drop your comments down below in the comments section, any questions you have. And if you are coming here to Ukraine, I do have my guidebook down below. It's also a way that you can support this kind of content that I make. I have a background in international relations. As I said, I've been living here, even with this war, about half the time. And I look forward to seeing maybe this as a solution to the war in the future. Slava Ukraini, Героям слава, до перемоги.